Keir Starmer's government is laser focused on signing a new trade deal with Israel despite its genocidal assault on Gaza, and is holding talks with one of Benjamin Netanyahu's most extreme ministers, a man who said that Israel was being too nice and too considerate in its bombardment of Palestinians. Joining me to discuss this story is my colleague, Mark Curtis.
Hi Phil, thanks for having me.
Can you tell us about the article you've just written for Declassified that looks at these trade talks between Britain and Israel?
Yeah, so this article is about how the Labour government has announced that it is going to push ahead with trade talks with Israel to try and secure a new trade agreement with the country. And actually, the Labour announced its intention to do that with Israel just 2 days after the Israelis had bombarded a school complex housing some refugees in Gaza, killing around 30 Palestinians, according to sources. And I think that this is a microcosm of the problem with this trade agreement, that the UK is in effect rewarding Israel by pushing ahead with negotiating a new accord. And it's interesting also when you look at who the ministers are who are involved in negotiating this agreement. On the one hand, there's the guy from Britain who's Jonathan Reynolds, who's the new trade secretary, who's actually a vice chair of Labour Friends of Israel, one of the major parliamentary lobby groups in the country. And Reynolds himself has been on 2 trips to Israel, organised by Labour Friends of Israel. On those trips, he even accepted a small amount of funding directly from the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And on the other side of the negotiations is Israel's economy minister, Nir Barkat, who is one of the most extreme proponents of the Israeli war in Gaza. On several occasions, Barkat has actually rebuked Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, for having a too restrained military policy in Gaza. A few months ago, he called for more bombardments in Gaza to pave the way for Israeli soldiers on the ground, saying that the lives of Gazans weren't as important as the lives of those Israeli soldiers. So Barkat has been very outspoken in terms of support for this war, and he's tipped as Netanyahu's successor. So he's the man that Jonathan Reynolds, the trade secretary, is dealing with in these talks. And I think it shows that this is another aspect of the British complicity in Israel's war in Gaza, pushing ahead with this trade agreement at a time when the mass attacks on Palestinians have not stopped, they've continued, at a time when those Israeli leaders are still wanted for war crimes by the International Criminal Court.
Jonathan Reynolds took over as Trade Secretary from Kemi Badenoch, a Conservative politician who was very pro-Israel and is now a frontrunner to be the next Tory party leader. Have you noticed any real difference between her policy under the Conservatives towards trade with Israel and the new Labour government's?
Nothing has emerged in public about any differences at all. In fact, if anything, the only difference, I would say, is that Britain seems to be stepping up its commercial relations with Israel since Labour's got into power. So, for example, the British Embassy in Tel Aviv in Israel has been talking about a wealth of opportunities for new deals between British and Israeli companies. A few weeks ago, the British Council announced a new fund to support UK and Israeli researchers in scientific research. There's a government body called the UK Innovation Fund, which has also announced a new fund for UK and Israeli researchers. So the idea that sanctions is anywhere near the British government agenda is obviously false. Sanctions against Israel are completely off the agenda. If anything, Labour is stepping up commercial relations with Israel over the Conservatives. And one thing I find very interesting about this is actually how easy it would be, relatively, for the Labour government to promote sanctions against Israel if it was even remotely interested. Trade between the UK and Israel is worth about £6 billion, which sounds a lot in volume terms, but actually only amounts to 0.3% of the UK's overseas trade. Israel is the 41st largest trading partner with the UK, so it's not a big trade partner. It could easily enact sanctions on Israel if it wanted. In fact, if you compare it to Russia, When the UK put sanctions on Russia in 2022 after the invasion of Ukraine, UK trade with Russia was around double the level that UK trade with Israel currently is. And yet Whitehall put sweeping sanctions right across the board on Russia following the invasion. Absolutely nothing at all with Israel. And that's because the UK supports it, of course. The UK supports Israel. It wants a trade deal. It has military relations. It has diplomatic relations. It supports their strategy, frankly, in Gaza. And Labour's call for a ceasefire, which is their formal declared position, I think is basically rhetoric. Labour's not doing anything that we can see in public to bring about a ceasefire. They're stepping up trade relations, as I'm documenting. The military relationship continues. The diplomatic relationship continues. So these are worrying signs that Britain will remain complicit in Israel's attacks on Palestinians, no matter what level they reach. I think that's the conclusion that we can easily spot, that no level of humanitarian atrocity seems to be sufficient for Labour to actually take real action against this state whose leaders are wanted for war crimes.
And last week we saw one of the main British medical charities in Gaza, one that's actually funded by the Foreign Office. It's called UKmed. It has field hospitals in Gaza. Its residential compound was actually shelled in an area where the Israeli military was operating. They haven't directly apportioned blame to either party, but it looks very much like it was Israeli shelling that was responsible for that. And like you say, these trade talks just seem to carry on regardless of how many civilian targets Israel hits, including those of British nationals. Of course, we had the British aid workers who were killed earlier this year. And there was the compound for another medical aid for Palestinians, another British medical charity that was bombed by the Israeli Air Force. In some of these cases, British-made weapons are believed to have been responsible in some capacity. Can you tell us where we're at now with this debate on the arms sales to Israel? Is there any sign that Labour might change course, at least on that front, slightly?
This is also interesting, I think, because Jonathan Reynolds, who's responsible for these trade talks and promoting the bilateral free trade agreement with Israel, is, of course, responsible also for Britain's arms exports to Israel, at least one of the ministers, along with the foreign minister and the defense ministers and so on. And there has been a couple of sporadic reports over the last few months that Labour may have been considering suspending arms exports, but there's no evidence that that is in place. The indications are that the UK is still supplying Israel with military equipment. Now, what I find particularly interesting about this is that in the last couple of years, the amount of arms, military equipment that the UK has supplied to Israel has not been that great. I mean, it certainly has been great over the last 15 years or so. We're talking about over £500 million worth of weapons have been sent, or military equipment have been sent to Israel. But in the last couple of years, Israel has not been a major arms market for the UK. So again, it would not be that difficult for the UK to restrict, suspend, cut off entirely those arms exports. But I think what this is all about is it's about the overall support that the UK is giving to Israel. It's been reported that Benjamin Netanyahu would be shocked and dismayed if Britain did enact an arms embargo on Israel, because it would send a signal that Britain was getting more serious about reining in Israeli atrocities. So clearly the Israelis are worried about a kind of a signal that would be sent by cutting off arms exports. But still, the UK is not doing that. And in fact, in opposition, David Lammy said, the current Foreign Secretary, said a number of times that if Israel were to use British equipment in attacks on Palestinians, then Labour would suspend arms exports. But that explicit policy has never been put into place. So clearly, I think Labour have decided, at least in terms of a declared public position, not to annoy the Israelis by going any further than they already have done on their arms export policy. And as you're suggesting, we don't really know what British equipment is being used by Israel across the board. We know that Israeli jets have spare parts that are manufactured in the UK. We know that a British company manufactures ejector seats for those fighter jets, and that if Britain were serious about wanting to halt Israeli combat operations, they could look at the sale of those ejector seats. But there's other equipment that's been provided by the UK to Israel over the years that we don't know whether Israel is using. Now, there's meant to be a review going on in government. David Lammy announced the review pretty soon after he took office as Foreign Secretary. And this review is meant to be considering whether Israel is committing violations of international humanitarian law, which is just nonsense, frankly. I mean, everyone and his brother in the whole world knows that Israel is committing violations of humanitarian law. It's an absolute no-brainer. It's absolutely obvious that the UK is meant to be abiding by its own arms export guidelines, which reject the idea that we should be supplying states committing human rights abuses. So all of this there's a lot of rhetoric, there's a lot of propaganda, there's a lot of rhetoric, and the bottom line is that Labour is committed to supporting Israel. And that's the sad truth about this whole situation, I think, at this time.
Thanks, Mark, for joining us today to discuss your latest article. If you want to support more research like this by Declassified, please subscribe to this channel. You can leave a donation by pressing the Super Thanks button, or you can join Declassified from £3 a month by heading to our website. I'll put the links in the video description below. Thanks again, Mark.